Hi everyone, I'm Benjamin Mack. I run the school at Mood Fabrics in New York City and LA, Mood U Fashion School. And I am here today to continue with part 2 of our sleeve draping. So what I'm going to be showing you today is how to transfer the drape that we did in part 1 onto pattern paper so that you have a record of your pattern. So the first thing we want to do is we take our muslin pattern that we draped, and I'm just going to realign my pieces and put some pins in just to hold it all together. And then once I've got this ready to go, I'm going to show you a way that you can transfer to paper. There's different ways that you can do this. I guess it depends on what you have. So what I'm going to show you today is I'm going to be using my serrated tracing wheel. We sell these on moodfabrics.com. The product code for these is 10093, and they're really useful. They're very sharp, so be careful. You can also get another tracing wheel that has a blunt edge, and if you're using that, you would want to be using tracing paper. So the technique that I'm going to do today is going to be using the sharp spiky tracing wheel, and I'm actually going to perforate the line into my pattern paper. So another good thing to have is going to be a cutting mat. So cutting mat product code is 100823 at moodfabrics.com. What I want to do is just protect the table that I'm working on. You may have a work table where it doesn't really matter, or you may be working on your dining table, and you want to make sure that you protect that. So I'm going to place my cutting mat down on the table. Then I'm going to take my pattern paper. You can use any paper for a pattern really, but if you want to use the real deal, then you've got this pattern paper that has the grid marked on it. And we have this with product code 11975 on our website, so you can always pick up some of that. So I've got my cutting mat down and my pattern paper on top. Now I'm going to take my muslin that I have draped, on my sleeve, and I'm going to place that on top. I want to make sure that I've got a big enough piece of paper, so I've got just enough, and I am going to, with my tracing wheel, just roll along the lines. Now when you're doing this, you want to be careful. You don't want to push the fabric. One thing that you can use, if you want to keep it all together, you can either pin the muslin to the pattern paper, or you can use these pattern weights. So if you want to use the pattern weights, they're really handy because they just weigh everything down and keep it all in place. While you're in the middle of tracing a pattern, what you don't want to do is bump it out of position, because you'll just have to start again. It's very hard to realign all of this if you're halfway through. So my suggestion is, if that does happen, and it can happen, then just start again, start fresh. The other technique that I'm not going to show you today, only because I don't have all of the materials here with me, I'm using what I've got, is to use a tracing paper. Product code is 10093 for that on our website. If you're using the tracing paper, you can take it and place it in between your pattern paper and your muslin drape, and then you can use the blunt edge tracing wheel, and as you just roll along all of the lines of your pattern shape, that will transfer the markings onto your paper. So that's another great way to do this. So I've got pattern weights for today. Keeping all of that in place, I've got my serrated tracing wheel, and I'm just very carefully going to roll along the line. So what I want to make sure of is that I'm not pushing the fabric out of position. So don't push forward, push down if you can. That's really important. So I'm going along. And if you feel like the fabric has pushed a little bit, just kind of release the wheel just to let it flatten out again. All right, so that is the sleeve cap, the rounded part of the top of my sleeve traced. I'm just going to put a little mark in for the two underarm seam edges, and I can continue that down the page once I'm actually drawing the lines onto the paper. So the main thing that I needed draped is done. Now I'm also just going to put a little mark up at the shoulder, so just where that the vertical line was that was running down the center of our top piece of the sleeve, little mark there. And then I also want to have a mark at the, if you remember, we put pins in at the front and the back of the armhole on the dress form. So where those lines are, I'm going to put a mark there as well. All right, so I take away my pattern weights and take away my muslin. So now what I have is something that you really can't see very well right now, at least not on the camera. I can see it enough, so I'm going to draw in my lines. Now, I like to use a variety of rulers. I've got this, this design ruler. I've got my quilt and sew ruler, which is very trusty. This is one of my favorite pieces of equipment. And then I am going to take my pencil. Now, if you want to have a look at a really good ruler, we've got a styling design ruler on our website. The product code is 1000064. You can check that out. That's got like a French curve side to it, and then it's also got something similar to this quilt and sew ruler, which will help you with seam allowances. I'm going to show you how to do seam allowances in a minute. So now I want to, just where I've got the straight edges, I can use my ruler. That's very easy. Let's put in the beginnings of my line. And then you can use a French curve. I prefer to work freehand, but a French curve is really, really good to use when you're just getting familiar with the lines and the shapes and what they should look like. So I highly recommend getting a French curve into your kit, or the styling design ruler that I just mentioned, because it will really help you just with guiding the lines and getting a nice clean line. So I am just going to trace in my line here. And as I'm doing this, you can see I'm kind of moving my pencil in a bit of a sketchy fashion, just like slowly building in the line onto my pattern paper. And those little marks that I created at the shoulder and for the front and the back pin markers that we put on the form, I'll put a mark in for those. I'll just continue straight down on this side. All right, so you can see here now I have the initial shape of my sleeve pattern. Now this is going to need to have seam allowance, otherwise what you'll be doing, if you don't have the seam allowance and then you go and try to sew this in, you're actually going to be sewing in something a lot smaller because you're going to be losing all of that seam allowance space. So I like to always add just a 1/2 inch seam allowance. There are different times for different widths of seam allowance, but a 1/2 inch for me is usually the most common that I would use. So trusty quilt and sew ruler, I line this up and there's a 1/2 inch line marked out on this, so I just line that up, and then as I go, so when I'm going along the curved lines, what I do is I just mark in a little bit at a time and I keep just pivoting the ruler around to follow the curve of my sleeve cap. And when you're doing this, just take your time. You want to make sure that it's accurate. The whole thing with putting all of this work into creating your sleeve pattern is that you get a really well-fitting and clean sleeve pattern to work with for whichever bodice it was that you're making this for. Now you remember in part 1 I said that the sleeve pattern that you're making could just go straight down and be kind of stovepipe in a way. Or what we can also do is taper it slightly. And this will become a very useful pattern that you can do a lot of pattern manipulation to. So you could take this and turn it into a bishop sleeve, or you could make it into a flared sleeve, or you could do a balloon sleeve. There's all of these different things that you could do. And I'm pretty sure in the future we'll come back and do some more pattern manipulation videos for you so that you can see some of the fun things that you can do with pattern manipulation. And once you've got a good fitting set of blocks, really the world is your oyster. You can do whatever you like. So what I need to do is decide on what my sleeve length is going to be. I'm just going to do a fairly average sleeve length. I've only got a small length of paper here, so probably I'm just going to be kind of ruled by that, pardon the pun. So I'm going to come down, I'm going to start up at the shoulder point and I'm going to come straight down. I'm going to follow the grid that is on my paper. This is why the grid paper or the pattern paper is really useful to have, because it helps you keep everything very straight. And come down to there. Okay, so I'm going to go with 20 inches right now. So that's probably a little bit shorter than what I would want. Maybe about 23 to 24 would be a good length to start with for most of the time. And it depends, if you're like me and you've got very long arms, then you can never find sleeves long enough, right? Can anyone else out there relate to that? Okay, so I've got my sleeve length in, and then along the bottom of my page, I'm just going to draw straight across. And then from here, I'm going to taper in, so I get a slightly more fitted sleeve. Now, like I said, you can do whatever you like with this sleeve. It's very versatile, and you can just leave it as a straight sleeve, or if you want to have your block already be slightly tapered, then you can do this alteration now. So I've drawn straight across the bottom, and what I'm going to do now is just front and back. I'm going to come in by about an inch. Well, let's do an inch and a quarter. It's such a variable thing, so you can really go with what you like here. The other good thing that's useful to do is to measure around the wrist and just see what the circumference is, or even the wider part of the hand, because you want to be able to get this sleeve on and off, unless it's a very fitted sleeve and there's going to be some kind of an opening. But you can do that as well. Just get the circumference of your wrist or the widest part of your hand, and make sure that the width of the bottom of your sleeve is equal to that. And remember, don't forget the seam allowances. Okay, so now from the underarm of my sleeve, I'm going to rule an angled line down. I'm going to do the same front and back. I'm going to just draw in my seam allowances as well. And the last thing to do, once I've got all these lines drawn, my seam allowances are added, the last thing to do is just to notate the pattern. So write on it what it is, it's a sleeve, and sometimes I'll use a Sharpie to do this. So if it's for a particular style or a particular bodice that you're fitting it to, you could always reference that as well, just so you can keep track of your patterns. You can, if it's a particular size, you could, if you're working to a specific size dress form and you're not making necessarily something that is for an individual size, but something that's more of a generic size, then you could write the size on as well. So I was working with a size 6 form, so I'm going to write 6 and circle it. And then cutting instructions. So usually you're going to write cut 2 because you need a left and a right sleeve. So that is probably the best thing to put, cut 2. And that's it. That is your sleeve pattern transferred. So now all we have to do is cut it out, and we are done. So I'll finish cutting this out in a moment, but I want to hold this up and show you what it should look like. One other thing that you need to mark out on your pattern before we forget is the balance notches for the sleeve cap. So on the front, always as a rule, you'll have a single notch, and on the back you'll have a double notch. So we've got those pin markers that we used, and on our bodice pattern that we were starting with, I can make sure that those marks from the dress form are also transferred onto my bodice pattern. So I'm going to do a single notch on the front, and then on the back I'm going to do a double notch. So I'll start with the initial mark, and then I'll drop down ½ an inch, and I'll put another mark so you can see, I'll hold this up, that it will look like that. You can see a double notch on the back, a single notch on the front. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to get back to cutting this out. Tune in for part 3, where I'm going to show you how we can set the sleeve in to our bodice armhole just to make sure that everything fits right. All right, thanks for watching. See you next time.